Hello and welcome to Windows in Time, the Mayor's Gift, the enduring legacy of Clarence Meeker, presented by Jackson County Library Services and the Southern Oregon Historical Society. I am Leah Pastizo, Digital Services Specialist. This program is being recorded, so please mute your microphone and turn off your camera to ensure quality recording. There will be a time to answer your questions at the end of the program. Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Shasta, Takelma, and Lakawa people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, as well as of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and Modoc Nation, who were forced to relocate to Oklahoma. We take this moment to recognize the indigenous people whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org/land. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services.
We're going to learn about a gift of a Medford mayor. And Larry Smith was just reminding me that if you want more information, you can go to Ben Truey's Southern Oregon History Revised, and he has a lot more material on this topic, so you can learn even more. And our speaker today is a local historian and retired community college administrator. Long interest in Southern Oregon history, is a member of the board of the Southern Oregon Historical Society and an active volunteer at the society. I'm not quite sure how he got interested in this particular person, but it's one of these unique, never heard of him before people that turns out to be really significant. Okay, so without further ado, I will introduce you to the speaker, Larry Mullaly, whom I know pretty well.
Good afternoon. The way these things get discovered is I was just curious about the founding of the Historical Society, and which has excellent records of it, that part of its history. And his name appeared all the time, a lot. And the more I probed into it, the more I learned, and it eventually turned into this talk. So I really appreciate you coming, and I want to say that the really fine photos that you'll see in this PowerPoint presentation are just about all from the collections of the Southern Oregon Historical Society, as are most of the documents and things that appear. The Mayor's Gift, the enduring legacy of Clarence Meeker. On Friday, December 28, 1948, 65-year-old Clarence Meeker,
That one didn't
mayor
work.
of Medford,
Oh, maybe it would do this
died
one.
in his home
No,
on East Main
let's do
Street.
this one right here.
He was the straightest of arrows. A staunch Methodist, Clarence Alfred Meeker was born on an Iowa
Now
farm
we go a couple
in the
more.
middle of the Corn Belt in 1882. When he was 11, his family moved
One
to the
more.
small but growing town of Medford, Oregon.
Now it's not fun.
It was a society where memories of the early Rogue Valley Euro-American families ran deep. Founding stories were told and retold at the annual meeting of the Pioneer Society of Southern Oregon, where families of the
Where does
valley
this come from?
paid
Oh,
tribute
we're hitting the arrow.
to the deceased friends and joined together. That's the correct picture. Next slide. Okay. In the singing,
Okay, this is
the
all this
pioneer
has in there.
song that spoke of a valley that now teems with beauty, where great plenty crowns our cheer. Give honor to whom honors due, the brave old pioneer. In Southern Oregon, few titles were held in higher regard than that of pioneer. As a student in Medford's public school, Clarence Meeker thrilled to the words of poet Joaquin Miller, who rhapsodized about the state's, quote, storied glory days, this new true land of noblest deeds. A conscientious, popular student, Clarence Meeker spent evenings and weekends working as an accountant in his father's Medford Mercantile, a name soon simplified to MM Store. It was time in which stories of young men who had made good by hard work were widely read, and Clarence Meeker was a true believer. His ability to meet and mingle and enjoy ordinary people. Following their marriage in 1910, both were active in efforts of building a greater Medford. Many did it through various women's groups, and Clarence in the Medford Commercial Club, a booster organization whose members saw themselves as modern-day pioneers. In 1915, the club partnered with the county commissioners to fund a promotional film to show at the San Francisco Pan-Pacific Exposition. The silent movie was titled Grace Visits the Rogue River Valley and featured stories of the valley's early history told by 80-year-old pioneers, leading to scenes of gracious country living. The public eagerly embraced the tale, and showings in Medford of Gracie's visit to the Rogue River Valley were often sold out. The Meekers shared a strong sense of flag and country. During World War I, Clarence joined 100 other men from Medford's business community to enlist in the Oregon National Guard and met every Tuesday night in uniform to drill and to learn military matters. In 1920, many enrolled in the Daughters of the American Revolution, a group involved in many projects marking pioneer era locations in Jackson County. When a new state song, Oregon, My Oregon, was written that same year, Minnie's piano playing accompanied Clarence as he sang, "Land of the empire builders, upward and onward ever, forward and on, hail to thee, land of heroes, my Oregon." In 1924, Southern Oregonians basked in the glow of the epic silent movie Covered Wagon, a movie in which Jacksonville's Alice Applegate Sargent was a primary historical consultant. It was the biggest film produced in Hollywood since Birth of a Nation, and was dedicated to the, quote, lion-hearted men and women who carved a splendid civilization out of an uncharted wilderness. In Medford, overflow audiences packed the Rialto Theater's 5 daily showings. But interest in things past was not anything really new. For decades, one of the region's most celebrated attractions was the Jacksonville Table Rock Saloon's Cabinet of Curiosities. The Cabinet of Curiosities displayed rocks, dinosaur bones, old weapons, and kitchen items, all taken from what one writer described as, quote, the olden golden days. In 1924, a small museum was opened in Jacksonville's Bruner Building, followed that same year by the opening of a second small museum in the old U.S. Hotel. Elsewhere in the county, a half-dozen Southern Oregon service organizations engaged in historical preservation projects of some kind. None of this escaped the watchful eye of Clarence Meeker, but his attention was elsewhere. In 1923, he had relocated the department store, as it was now called, to the Howard Block building in downtown Medford at 6th and Central. Here he passed his days surrounded by socks, baby clothes, scarves, shoes, and the latest San Francisco fashion, and became a familiar sight to hundreds of shoppers each day. The business thrived. By the end of the decade, the MM's department store had 20 employees and was the largest store in the city. During this time, whatever free time Meeker had was dedicated to the community. He served as president of the Jackson County Merchants Association and helped found the YMCA. In 1930, he was elected by his neighbors in the city's 4th Ward to the Medford City Council. It was shortly after this time that Medford, population 11,000, was asked by the state legislature to host a Diamond Jubilee anniversary of statehood, and the city jumped at the opportunity to show itself off. The event, not surprisingly, was dedicated to the Oregon pioneer. And it was estimated that 50,000 spectators would attend, many arriving in automobile caravans from throughout the Northwest. The event, which took place at the height of the Great Depression, would be the largest public spectacle ever staged in Southern Oregon, and featured a massive parade tracing the heritage of the state from, quote, the Stone Age to the Orchard era. Horse-drawn floats displayed the origins of many early Rogue Valley settlers. Missouri, Arkansas, Iowa, Texas, Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee. State and federal dignitaries rode on horseback. And in the windows of the Sparta building at the corner of Main and Riverside, 20 families contributed pioneer items so that others might enjoy them. Such memorabilia was also displayed in other Medford store windows and in Jacksonville. The evenings during the week-long event were capped off with performances at the fairgrounds of a historic pageant that featured 500 actors and a large orchestra. But there had been one notable absence. Clarence Meeker, the man who never failed to appear at a civic function, had been confined to bed at his East Main Street home. He was recovering from a month-long confinement in Medford's community hospital, where he had undergone 2 major surgeries for appendicitis. In the months following the great pageant, there was talk about keeping the pieces together to create a large permanent museum in Medford or in Jacksonville. But nothing was done, and the Depression once more wrapped itself around people's lives. Meeker's life was also changing. In the wake of his surgery, he continued to teach Bible classes as he had always done, and sing in the church choir. But some of the spark was gone. And in March 1937, at the relatively young age of 49, he announced his retirement from business and the sale of the department store to a Grants Pass merchant. During the next 2 years, Clarence and Minnie motored thousands of miles across the United States, visiting schools, museums, and historic sites. Always Medford boosters, they carried brochures of the Rogue Valley to distribute wherever they went. In Connecticut, Clarence discovered his own colonial roots, leading him to apply in 1940 for membership in the Southern Oregon chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, a patriotic organization with an emphasis on history and community service. That same year, he was elected once again to the Medford City Council, and 2 years later, chosen to serve as Medford's mayor. The man that had always worked quietly in the background now came to the fore. Clarence Meeker was the first mayor to have his office in City Hall. In 1943, he convened a panel of elected officials and city employees to develop a water and sewer plan for all of Medford as soon as the war was over. He became a familiar face in Salem, and as president of the League of Oregon Cities, was constantly moving about the state, consulting with local officials of over 100 municipalities. He served as director of emergency wartime housing for the county, for the Jackson County. During his many travels, he had become concerned that Southern Oregon was losing its heritage. Antique collectors were scooping up artifacts, old timers were passing, and memories fading. And so he began working with leaders from several local associations who sought to preserve the valley's legacy. The topic had been discussed for decades, but no one had ever done anything about it. But Meeker had a vision of using his membership in the Sons of the American Revolution to move the history project forward. When the Southern Oregon Sons of the American Revolution met in February 1945, their minutes record, compatriot C.A. Meeker made a talk on the desirability of a permanent program or project for the chapter. He suggested that the chapter preserve, quote, the historic Jacksonville Courthouse as a repository for pioneer relics and records, end quote. That same evening, the chapter responded by appointing a small committee with Meeker to be chairman of a June dinner meeting that would include the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Pioneer Society of Southern Oregon. Drawing from his many, many contacts, Meeker proceeded to assemble a dinner list that included the mayors of Jacksonville, Medford, and Ashland, the 3 county commissioners, and nearly 100 invited guests from civic and historical groups in the region. More importantly, he induced the governor of Oregon, Earl Snell, to attend. In an address that Snell delivered that evening, the well-prepped governor urged, quote, all Jackson County and all Southern Oregon to back the Rogue River Chapter Sons of the American Revolution in the campaign to have the old courthouse building in Jacksonville named into a museum to not only, quote, honor the pioneers, but attract tourists and visitors to the region. When the meeting adjourned, the governor moved to the courthouse steps to address 400 people who had stood in the dark for hours to hear him repeat the address that he had just given inside. And the following day, the Medford Mail Tribune headlined the event, "Governor urges all to support museum project." It was purely coincidental that 6 months earlier, the Saturday Evening Post had begun publishing a serialized novel on early Jacksonville entitled Canyon Passage. It was written by the same author who had written the Academy Award motion picture Stagecoach. Soon after the Jacksonville dinner took place, Warner Brothers Studio in Hollywood announced plans to turn the story into a major blockbuster motion picture. It would be shot in Southern Oregon. And by September, the Hollywood production crew was on location at a former civilian conservation camp near Diamond Lake, where a large set depicting Jacksonville in the Gold Rush era had been built. The Chamber of Commerce in Medford, of which Meeker was a member, was deeply involved in the venture. It enlisted 50 members of the Jackson County Sheriff's Posse to take part in the film. It rushed to find old wagons and identify 90 citizens willing to gather at the Chamber of Commerce each morning at 6:30 a.m. to board the bus for Diamond Lake and be extras in the movie. Meanwhile, Meeker cast a broader net. He had begun meeting with the leadership of the well-established Oregon Historical Society in Portland. Meeker agreed to serve as a board member of the Portland-based society. In exchange, Lancaster Pollard, the talented executive director of the Oregon Historical Society, pledged to serve on the board of the Southern Oregon Historical Society once it was organized. When the Sons of the American Revolution convened their annual meeting on February 22nd at Rupp's Dining Room in Central Point, the featured speaker that year was Lancaster Pollard. In his talk, he recommended that a new group be formed to take over the museum project from the Sons of the American Revolution, and that this group be named the, quote, Southern Oregon Historical Society. And a week after the dinner meeting, the board of the freshly christened Southern Oregon Historical Society met for the very first time in the mayor's office at Medford City Hall. The list of board members that Meeker had gathered was impressive. In addition to Meeker and Lancaster Pollard, it included the president of the Daughters of the American Revolution, a county commissioner, the editors of the Grants Pass Courier and Medford Mail Tribune, the secretary of the Pioneer Society, the superintendent of Medford Public Schools, the Medford High School principal, the director of the Jackson County Chamber of Commerce, and a prominent Medford realtor. On the evening of that first meeting, Meeker paid $2 to become the society's first member and was elected society president. Enthusiasm ran high. 900 signatures were needed to put the measure on the ballot, and the Chamber of Commerce pledged to do the work. There were hopes of enlisting 1,000 members to the society within a few weeks. A day had hardly passed when the Chamber of Commerce, now acting as the society's unofficial headquarters, was inundated with heirlooms offered to the project. And there was talk of obtaining back from the Southern Oregon Historical Society in Portland items then in their care that belonged to Southern Oregon. And there were also expectations that the publicity surrounding the release of Canyon Passage would serve as a springboard for a successful levy vote. All the pieces seem to be falling into place. On July 13th, Hollywood stars and dignitaries coming for the world premiere of the movie arrived in Portland by plane and immediately took part in a torchlight parade of men and women dressed as Native Americans and pioneers, led by no less than Oregon Governor Earl Snell. An Associated Press reporter described how, quote, Portland was completely captured by the movie forces. 2 weeks later, Canyon Passage came to Medford in all its Technicolor splendor. A portrayal of early Oregon in, quote, its brawny, brawling glory. A critic hailed the film as the finest drama of Oregon and the Pacific Northwest ever filmed. For a week, the Criterion Theater ran 5 performances a day. And people flocked to see friends and neighbors who had managed to get parts as extras in the production. But something had gone dreadfully wrong. Canyon Passage came and left Medford, but the Historical Society, newly founded, was nowhere to be seen. The Meeker crusade that had begun on such a promising note just 4 months earlier had simply vanished. What happened? Several weeks before the arrival of Canyon Passage in Medford, Meeker had unexpectedly received word that the Jackson County Commissioners lacked the power to collect taxes to benefit historic preservation. The only way to resolve this was a special act of the legislature, but the state legislature would not be in session until February of the following year, several months after the looked forward to levy vote was to have taken place. The directors turned the matter over to Meeker, the man who solved all problems. And Meeker, with the help of the Medford City Attorney and Oregon Historical Society in Portland's legal talent, crafted the needed resolution. He also enlisted the 3 Jackson County legislatures to support the measure in the upcoming Salem legislature. The resolution allowed any county in Oregon to establish a modest historic county fund that would not be subject to state tax limitations. And it easily passed in both houses and was signed into law by Governor Snell. The Southern Oregon Historical Society now had the ability to propose a measure to voters to support the museum project. But the next general election, when this could take place, would not be until November of 1948, more than a year away, during which time public support and enthusiasm for the measure would have to be rebuilt, almost from scratch. To keep interest alive, Meeker applied for a $5,000 of county fund emergency funds for urgently needed repairs for the Jacksonville courthouse. The county budget committee endorsed the measure, but the county commissioners rejected it on legal grounds, leaving the Historical Society with no funds or work to do. Monthly meetings were suspended. It disappeared from the news. A picture taken of Meeker at this time, launching a fundraising campaign for handicapped veterans, shows a beaming, competent civic leader. But Meeker, exhausted by his work and in ill health, was a spent man. Several weeks after Christmas, he was reported to be in the hospital. The mayor was failing. On February 28, 1948, Clarence Alfred Meeker, Medford's first citizen, died of heart failure in his East Main Street home. He was buried in the mausoleum of the Oddfellow Cemetery, adjacent to his wife Millie, who had passed away several years earlier. An editorial in the Medford Mail Tribune spoke of how he had worked unceasingly, quote, toward establishing a Southern Oregon museum, and that his willing devotion to civic duty had hastened his death. It urged that the Jacksonville Museum, when it came to be regarded as an appropriate and fitting memorial to a dedicated public servant. Thanks to the groundwork laid by Clarence Meeker, the levy authorizing the public funding of the museum and society was approved by the people of Jackson County in November of 1948. And the long-awaited museum opened to the public 2 years later. 7,961 visitors passed through the building on the first day. And 2 years later, the museum welcomed its 100,000th visitor. In the nearly 80 years that have passed since Meeker's death, the society he established has served as a repository of regional memory, an irreplaceable deposit of historic artifacts, art and photographs, documents and records. It is the enduring legacy of Clarence Meeker brought forward, which we all share today. But the greatest legacy and gift of Clarence Meeker, perhaps, was the man himself. Dedicated to the service of the community, often besieged by mundane matters, he never failed to look up to the higher things of life, and as he did so, lift up the many people he met along the way. As a follow-up to the presentation, I asked Ron Kramer, our Southern Oregon Historical Society Executive Director, to contribute a few words about the current state of the society and the museum. And he writes, quote, since the period of retrenchment in SOHS operations, the society, without county levy support, has continued to maintain the second largest collection of historic material in Oregon. Its research library and archives have been kept open to the public, and its programming has continued. Throughout these years, SOHS has consistently held to a commitment to reestablish a museum at its downtown historic J.C. Penney building. This past June, SOHS publicly announced that the museum would open October 1st of this year. Unfortunately, several days after the announcement was made, the building suffered major water damage, which occurred because of work being then done to replace its roof. The Southern Oregon Historical Society remains eager to publicly share its artifact collection and resources in a new museum, and is working to make that happen. Stay tuned. thank you for joining us today, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes. No, let me correct that. The question was, did the Meekers have any children? There is a daughter. I'm not sure if she's adopted or not, and I did not follow that up too closely, but she doesn't come at you in the literature. So I could have learned more, but nothing ever went down that pathway. Yes.
Did we talk about how SOHS lost its funding?
No, because the real thing that mattered was you had a community that for decades had always talked about, we need to save our stuff. We need to protect our pioneer legacy. But often either nothing happened or the groups would be fighting with one another. The human dynamics just did not favor that kind of convergence. And then the question of funding is a very big issue. It's always a big issue. And even though the population was thrilled to dress up and take part in these historical recreations, that did not necessarily translate into votes. So the whole process of bringing this project to fruition, where you had what appeared to be massive support of all the leading movers and shakers, is a very big thing in the story. And then subsequently, you have 80 years of activity, ups and downs, lefts and right. But always during that time, the basic reality of a historic society was taken for granted. It was firmly in place, and that fact is owed to Mayor Meeker. Yes, Larry.
What's the plan for the museum now with the water damaged building?
The plan is that it will soon, the major remodeling that requires will soon take place.
Is the insurance covering it?
We believe it is. And the result is that much of the building, which was in pretty good shape, but will be in much better shape as they go forward. There's no timeline that I'm aware of, but the commitment is real. The heat was just turned on this week. And as they've mentioned, the portions of the museum that held archival materials were not damaged. And it's very significant. I mean, you can just have a nightmare scenario like a flood in Florence, and you have to take everything out and freeze dry it or something. But that the whole end of the building where the library is was not affected by this. So the areas where these large open spaces, but it has affected the ability of the building to be used for meetings and groups and such. And there's always a demand for it. So we hope to get that back again soon.
Yeah, it says we have a question online.
Yes.
Peter wanted to know, why was the funding removed from the Historical Society by the county?
That is a great question. Why was funding removed from the Historical Society? Sometimes the plans don't line up right, or maybe they did in this case. Right? At the time, it was that trajectory of events that led to the full removal started, which I believe was about 1998 or so. The last funding was received in 2007, but what mattered was that start point. There was a change in the state law that had been voted in by the citizens of Oregon that allowed counties to consolidate all these different funds. And so the history fund was among them. The county at that time seemed to be in a mode of trying to streamline things and get rid of efforts that were not considered prime needs at the time. And the Historical Society was one of them. I believe the library was also an area of concern, and eventually that also was spun off as a separate thing. And there were other things. And that just played itself out. And there was tremendous effort to make sure it didn't happen. but it did happen, and that's where we are. But that would be another story. And there's another story, and to me, which is a little more chipper, and that is the actual work of beginning the society, because I tell everything up to Meeker's death, and then we jump ahead 2 years and we have the society and everything goes forward. But you have kind of another group of characters, because the star-studded board that Meeker put together was politically chosen, a very wise one, but you had to have workers to actually get things going. And so you have another group of people, and prominent among them was Claire Hanley, very important. And she was on the original board. She's the secretary of the Pioneer Society that is mentioned in the story. But at Meeker's time, she was just one of the players, but then she emerges as a very significant force. So that's another time, another place.